Welcome to Voices, LGBTQ+ conversations at the library. Today, we welcome two guest presenters from Atlanta's Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, who will be speaking on topics related to health and healthcare in the LGBTQ+ community.
Hello, welcome to today's talk, LGBTQ Community and Health Disparities. We are so excited to have the opportunity to share this overview of who are the LGBTQ+ community and what are the specific health needs of LGBTQ+ people.
Hello, I'm also excited about this presentation today. It's related to two very important aspects of my own life, the fact that we're talking about LGBTQ+ health disparities and that it's being presented to members of the Gwinnett community. This presentation is a great way to share information on some very important but not well understood topics. The LGBTQ+ community is one, and the other is what health disparities are and why they matter in our individual lives. We are hopeful that you will find this talk with Michelle and I useful, and it will encourage you to learn more about this.
So, a quick introduction. My name is Michelle Johns. My pronouns are she, hers, and I'm a health scientist in CDC's Division of Adolescent and School Health. My work at CDC focuses on developing safe and supportive school environments with a particular focus on the needs of LGBTQ+ adolescents. And I've been engaged in work with LGBTQ+ communities for over 15 years.
And I'm the team lead in the Initiatives and Partnerships team within the Minority Health and Health Equity Activities Unit of the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity at CDC. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I am a proud gay man married to my wonderful partner of 25 years.
So to begin our conversation today, we want to provide a brief introduction to key vocabulary and terms that might be useful for those who are newer to thinking about LGBTQ+ identities.
To better understand the context that we will be discussing today, we will briefly define some terms that are used in public very loosely or that are becoming more commonly used. As you see here, the definition of culture refers to the customs, arts, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, people, or other social group. In this case, the LGBTQ+ community. And in that regard, the definition of LGBTQ+ community is the social and relational ties between people who are sexual and/or gender minorities, in this case, lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. Community comes together through political organizing for legal rights of sexual minorities, media representations of gay and lesbian characters in television and movies, presence of LGBT neighborhoods in metropolitan areas or social venues like restaurants or bars catering to LGBT clientele. Now, I'll hand this off to Michelle, who will do a deep dive into what constitutes the LGBTQ+ community, its culture, and afterwards, I'll come back and talk about the health disparities experienced by this community.
Thank you so much, Julio. So to ground us in this conversation about the LGBTQ+ community today, I want to introduce you to this handy graphic known as the gender bred person. So this graphic offers a visual presentation of aspects of human gender and sexuality, specifically gender identity, gender expression, sex, and romantic and sexual attraction. I'm showing this particular graphic to you briefly now, then we're going to walk through each of these concepts one by one, and we'll come back to the graphic in a few minutes to hopefully bring it all together for you. To start this conversation about definitions, let's take a closer look at sex and gender. So these two terms, sex and gender, often get used interchangeably in everyday speech, but they actually mean two very different things. By sex, we mean an individual's biological status as male or female. This typically is assigned at birth by a doctor or other medical provider, and the doctor or medical provider usually makes that assignment based on physical attributes such as external anatomy, chromosomes, and as individuals get older, secondary sex characteristics. Gender, on the other hand, is a social category. It refers to the roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that any society considers appropriate for an individual based on their sex. So in other words, we can think about gender as society's assumptions of how men and women should be. Aspects of gender include things like gender roles, gender identities, and gender expression. While sex is a universal human trait, the attributes ascribed to gender differ across cultures and historical periods. So one of the components you may have heard discussed in relationship to LGBTQ people is gender identity, though really everyone, LGBTQ plus or not, has a gender identity. Gender identity refers to how we think about ourselves internally, or what our psychological sense of ourselves is as men, women, or something else. Gender identity is always self-identified, and research shows that people develop a sense of their gender identity very early on in life, and that it continues to evolve over time. When we are thinking about the LGBTQ plus community, one of the most central terms related to gender identity is transgender. Transgender describes a specific relationship between the concepts of sex and gender identity. This word transgender simply means any person whose gender identity and sex assigned at birth are different from one another. The word transgender is often used as an umbrella term to encompass a very diverse community, including people with binary gender identities like transgender women and transgender men, as well as non-binary people. What do I mean when I talk about non-binary identities? Simply stated, non-binary people are anyone whose gender identity is something other than woman or man. Non-binary people do not neatly fall into these categories of male and female, and some identity labels you might hear that are related to non-binary identities include gender variant, gender expansive, gender fluid, gender queer, or bigender. As I mentioned earlier, everyone has a gender identity, not just LGBTQ plus people. That brings us to our next term, cisgender. Cisgender simply means a person whose gender identity and sex are the same. Simply stated, anyone who is not transgender is cisgender. One additional concept related to gender that is useful for starting to think about the complexity of gender in our lives is gender expression. As you recall, gender identity is about our internal sense of our gender. Gender expression, on the other hand, is a term used to describe how we present or express our gender outwardly to the world. Gender expression refers to the ways that we communicate our gender to the world through the way we dress, the way we wear our hair, and the way we communicate both verbally and non-verbally. Some terms you might have heard that relate to gender expression include feminine, masculine, or androgynous. Remember that gender expression is separate from gender identity. A person can identify as a woman but prefer more masculine forms of dress, or identify as non-binary and prefer to speak and wear their hair in more feminine ways. When people's gender expression differs from society's expectations of their gender identity, we might refer to them as gender nonconforming. Next up, we're going to turn our attention to sexual orientation and put gender aside for just a moment. Here I provide you with a foundational definition of sexual orientation that comes from the American Psychological Association. They say that sexual orientation refers to an enduring pattern of emotional, romantic, and/or sexual attractions to men, women, or both sexes. Sexual orientation also refers to a person's sense of identity based on those attractions, related behaviors, and membership in a community of others who share those attractions. I'd like to draw your attention to 3 words in this definition: identity, attraction, and behaviors. These are crucial building blocks of sexual orientation as understood by scientists and community members alike. Before moving on into a deeper discussion of these building blocks, I'd like to acknowledge that this definition of sexual orientation relies on a binary definition of gender. Given our conversation about the incredible diversity of gender that people experience and express, I'm offering a small tweak to this definition. Sexual orientation refers to an enduring pattern of emotional, romantic, and/or sexual attractions to men, women, non-binary people, many genders, or no one. Now let's turn our attention back to those 3 critical components of sexual orientation: identity, behavior, and attraction. Let's talk about what each of these mean. Identity refers to how someone labels or describes their sexuality, or the words or terms that they use to talk about their sexual orientation. So when you hear terms like gay, lesbian, bisexual, straight, pansexual, asexual, these are each describing people's sexual identity. Sexual behavior refers to who, if anyone, we engage in sexual activity with. You might have heard terms like men who have sex with men or women who have sex with women. These are phrases that describe an individual's sexual behavior. Finally, sexual attraction describes who we are sexually or romantically attracted to, whether that be men, women, non-binary folks, or people of many genders. Why do we talk about all three of these dimensions of sexual orientation? Well, while for many, identity, behavior, and attraction align in a predictable way, such as a woman who identifies as a lesbian, has sex with women, and is attracted to women, for other people, they do not align, such as a man who might identify as straight, have sex with women and men, and be attracted to women, men, and non-binary people. In the research, we talk about the differences across these dimensions as discordance, and we see it time and time again in surveys that aim to measure sexual orientation. Truly, this diversity in attraction, behavior, and identity simply reflects the complexity of human sexuality. Something I really want to emphasize as we come to the final couple slides about key identity terms is that sexual orientation is not the same as gender identity, or even necessarily aligned with it. All people have a sexual orientation and a gender identity, though how we may identify can change over time. So now, let's come back to our gender-bred person. I hope you feel like you have a good understanding of each of the parts listed out. Gender identity, our felt sense of self, is presented here in the brain. Attraction, who we are romantically or sexually interested in, presented here in the heart. Sex, an individual's assigned status of male or female based on their physical body, is presented here between the person's legs. And expression, how we show our gender out into the world, is outlined over the totality of the whole person. Let's come back to the title of this talk, the LGBTQ+ community. When we use that label, it of course literally describes the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community. But we also offer up this term as an umbrella term to include anyone whose sexual orientation is not heterosexual or whose gender identity is not cisgender. The word queer can also be used as shorthand for the LGBTQ+ community. However, it's a word with a complicated history, given that it formerly was a negative slur that then got reclaimed by LGBTQ+ persons as an empowering label. We should never assume that all LGBTQ+ folks are comfortable being described this way. We added the plus to the LGBTQ acronym to acknowledge that not every identity label included within the full rainbow of sexual and gender identities is reflected in those letters. Here are some examples of other identities that are included within the LGBTQ+ community on the right side of the slide. Those include pansexual, asexual, questioning, same-gender loving, non-binary, two-spirit, intersex, and many more that we don't have space to list here. Now I'm going to turn things back over to Julio, who's going to walk us through some information about LGBTQ+ health disparities.
Thanks, Michelle. Now that we've spent some time defining who we mean when we say LGBTQ+, let's talk a little bit about the health needs of this population. Health disparities are a type of health difference that is closely linked with social, economic, and/or environmental disadvantage. Health disparities adversely affect groups of people who have systematically experienced greater obstacles to health based on their particular characteristics. This can include multiple kinds of particular characteristics, including those listed here, which include race, religion, socioeconomic status, gender, age, just to name a few. These health disparities can be tracked by population to have an understanding of what are the unique health issues being faced by that population. When thinking about health differences among particular population groups, we therefore think about it in terms of specific characteristics. The two most common characteristics that we use to try to understand if and how there may be health differences is by a population's race and ethnicity. As you can see here, by race and ethnicity, I mean the following. It refers to a social construct based on ideology and common experiences, which attributes meaning to various factors and characteristics, including skin color and ancestral background. It also includes both the social interpretation of our physical appearance in a given place and time, or socially assigned race, as well as individual self-identified race or ethnicity. An example of where these kinds of characteristics come into play in the context of ethnicity is in the relationship between gender, ethnicity, and class to make up one specific ethnic group. In the next few slides, I will describe some of these health differences that the LGBTQ plus community is experiencing. LGBTQ plus people are disproportionately impacted by violence victimization. Here are some statistics from the National Crime Victimization Survey that show that LGBTQ plus adults report more rape and sexual assault, aggravated assault, and serious violence involving injury than non-LGBTQ plus adults. LGBTQ plus youth also are unduly affected by violence victimization. These numbers showcase the unequal rates of forced sex reported by LGBTQ high school students compared to their heterosexual and cisgender peers. These numbers reflect that LGBTQ plus youth are more likely to be threatened or injured with a weapon at school than heterosexual or cisgender youth. LGBTQ plus youth are also more likely to report suicide risk, such as having attempted suicide, than their heterosexual and cisgender peers. Another area of need for LGBTQ plus people is substance use. Here are some numbers from the 2019 National Health Interview Study and the 2013 Tobacco in a Changing Media Environment Study that point to LGBT and transgender adults being more likely to smoke cigarettes than heterosexual and cisgender adults. These patterns of use are also reflected among LGBTQ plus young people, as this data on current cigarette use among high school students reflects. Now that we've talked about some of the health disparities that LGBTQ plus communities deal with, I'll discuss some of the social conditions that make some of these health differences worse or even create them. Then, we'll talk about what we can do about them for what we know works in reducing the effects of some of these social conditions. Health equity is a principle in support of a just and fair inclusion into a society in which all people can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. The next few slides will focus on the definitions of terms related to how to reduce or eliminate health disparities and advance health equity. Health equity is the attainment of the highest level of health for all people. This is achieved when we value everyone equally with focused and ongoing societal efforts to address avoidable inequalities, historical and contemporary injustices, and the elimination of health and healthcare disparities. The following are examples for achieving health equity: a successful health equity strategy, data practices to support the advancement of health equity, laws, regulations, and rules to improve population health, and organizational structures and functions that support health equity. Social determinants of health are conditions in the environment in which people are born, live, learn, work, play, worship, and age that affect a wide range of health, functioning, and quality of life outcomes and risks. These conditions are related to health equity in that they can serve to make health equity possible or act as a barrier to achieving health equity. Some social conditions that drive, increase, or make health difference worse for specific populations occur because of discrimination. By discrimination, I mean the following: a socially structured action that is unfair or unjustified and harms individuals and groups. It's important to understand that some of the health differences that populations face are not at all related to their biological or genetic characteristics. A specific type of discrimination is known as racism. Racism is defined as the institutional and individual practices that create and reinforce oppressive systems of race relations, whereby people and institutions engaging in discrimination adversely restrict, by judgment and action, the lives of those against whom they discriminate. Structural racism is a type of structural discrimination focused on race or ethnicity. Structural discrimination refers to macro level conditions that limit opportunities, resources, and the well being of less privileged groups. Michelle will now talk a little bit about the specific social conditions and structural racism that act as particular barriers to health equity for LGBTQ people.
So, what is the social context that shapes health disparities for LGBTQ people? As Julio introduced, in any health equity conversation, it is essential for us to look upstream at what social and cultural factors shape the context for health disparities. Stigma and minority stress are two concepts that are believed to play a role in the health and well-being of LGBTQ people. When I'm talking about stigma, I'm talking about the labeling, stereotyping, separation, status loss, and discrimination of individuals based on their social status and characteristics, such as sexual orientation and gender identity. Racism, which Julio just described, is an example of a type of stigma. Minority stress refers to the process by which stigma is directed towards LGBTQ people in the form of violence, discrimination, and harassment, and then causes psychological stress, which impacts mental and physical health. When we talk about stigma, there are particular types of stigma that directly affect the lived experiences of LGBTQ people. Firstly, there is heterosexism. Heterosexism refers to the cultural belief that heterosexuality is normal, and therefore anyone who is not heterosexual is not normal. Heterosexism leads to the privileged status of heterosexuality in most aspects of people's lives and culture. Heterosexism also leads to the stigmatization of non-heterosexual behaviors, identities, relationships, and communities. Examples of this include media representations of queer people as socially deviant, or the lack of access to legal marriage and job protections for LGB folks for many years. Next, there is monosexism. Monosexism describes the assumption that everyone is or should be monosexual, which means attracted to no more than one gender. This belief is reinforced by offering institutional and social rewards for monosexual people, and by discriminating against bisexual people and others who are attracted to more than one gender. Examples of monosexism include the assumption that people share the same sexual identity as their romantic partners, and the social exclusion of bi and pansexual people from queer spaces. Finally, there is cisgenderism. This is the cultural belief that being cisgender is normal, and therefore anyone who is not cisgender is not normal. Cisgenderism delegitimizes people's own understandings of their genders and bodies. It also results in social, structural, and interpersonal barriers that stand in the way of transgender people thriving. Examples of cisgenderism include transgender people needing to be diagnosed with a disorder of gender dysphoria in order to receive gender-affirming medical and legal services.
Keep in mind that these types of discriminatory practices can come together in a variety of ways and across a variety of types of discrimination. For example, stigma or discrimination based on heterosexism, cisgenderism, monosexism, and racism can simultaneously affect a single person or groups of people.
Fantastic. Thank you, Julio, for that overview of stigma and structural discrimination. Now we know the landscape of the health needs of LGBTQ people and the reasons why those health needs exist. We want to leave you all with some examples of public health strategies that are designed to improve health equity for LGBTQ+ communities. One public health initiative that has great evidence of supporting the needs of LGBTQ+ youth in schools is Gay, Straight, or Gender and Sexuality Alliances, otherwise known as GSAs. GSAs are student-led clubs intended to provide safe spaces and support for LGBTQ+ youth and their allies, education on LGBTQ+ issues, opportunities to socialize, and a chance to build skills around community engagement. Research shows that LGBTQ+ youth who participate in GSAs have better education and health outcomes, and that schools with GSAs show improved school climate and health outcomes among all students, both LGBTQ+ and non-LGBTQ+ alike.
On your screen is a screenshot of public health initiatives that advance health equity specific to smoking trends among lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons. The information on this page is an example of the kinds of content we at CDC are making available to help people understand what they can do to reduce tobacco use among the LGBTQ+ community. Here's a screenshot of another page with more information specific to the LGBTQ+ community and specific groups within it, for example, the older LGBTQ+ population.
One resource available on the LGBT Health website is this paper that outlines strategies for making schools more inclusive for LGBTQ+ youth. If you have a particular interest in that topic, I recommend checking out this publication. And that brings us to the end of our conversation today. I hope you all have enjoyed this discussion. I know that I have.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share the work that we do at CDC with you. I hope you have found this information useful and encourage you to visit the web pages that we've shared here today, as well as share this presentation with your friends and loved ones. Stay in touch.
Many thanks to Michelle and Julio. We'll have a New Voices program ready in December of 2021.